Karen Jennings, the self-appointed queen of the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association, HOA, was having a particularly bad day. As she pulled into the community's immaculately manicured parking lot, her beady eyes narrowed in on a sight that immediately set her blood boiling. A bright red Jeep Wrangler parked in a spot reserved for residents with permits. That had them, she muttered under her breath, tightening her grip on the steering wheel of her shiny Mercedes SUV. I'll teach that rule breaker a lesson they'll never forget. Storming out of her car, Karen marched straight up to the Jeep, her heels clicking against the pavement with each determined step. She paused for a moment, surveying the vehicle with an air of superiority, before reaching into her oversized designer purse and retrieving a bright yellow parking ticket. "This'll show them who's in charge around here," she said, a twisted smile spreading across her face as she slapped the ticket onto the Jeep's windshield. But just as Karen was about to turn on her heel and head back to her car, she noticed a small, handwritten note tucked beneath the ticket. Curiosity getting the better of her, she snatched it up and quickly scanned the contents. "What in the world?" she exclaimed, her eyes widening in disbelief. The note, written in a neat, cursive script, read, "Dear homeowner, we regret to inform you that your attempt to issue a parking violation has been denied. The vehicle in question is under the protection of the Oakwood Hills Police Task Force, and any interference with its operation will be met with immediate consequences. We kindly ask that you refrain from further attempts to circumvent the rules of this community. Failure to comply may result in legal action. Sincerely, the Oakwood Hills Police Task Force." Karen's mouth hung open in stunned silence as she processed the information. A police task force? Protecting a mere Jeep? This was outrageous. Her nostrils flared with indignation, and she crumpled the note in her hand, her manicured nails digging into the paper. "We'll see about that," she growled, stomping back to her car and slamming the door behind her. Starting the engine, she gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. Nobody makes a fool of Karen Jennings and gets away with it. As she pulled out of the parking lot, a plan began to take shape in her mind. A plan that would not only teach the owner of the Jeep a lesson, but also put the so-called police task force in its place. With a determined glint in her eye, she set off, her mind racing with the delicious possibilities that lay ahead. Karen spent the rest of the day feverishly researching the Oakwood Hills Police Task Force, determined to uncover any weaknesses or vulnerabilities she could exploit. She scoured the internet, sifting through news articles and local government records, searching for any clues that might give her an edge. As the sun began to set, her efforts finally paid off. She stumbled upon an article that mentioned the task force was funded by a private grant rather than the city's budget. A devious smile spread across her face. If she could find a way to cut off their funding, the task force would be forced to disband, leaving the Jeep unprotected. "Time to make a few calls," Karen muttered, reaching for her phone. Over the next several hours, she utilized her extensive network of contacts and favors to gather information on the grant that was funding the task force. She learned that the grant was administered by a local philanthropist, a woman known for her strict adherence to rules and regulations. "Perfect," Karen purred, already formulating her plan. If she could somehow convince the philanthropist that the task force was misusing the grant funds, the money would be pulled, and the task force would be forced to disband. With renewed vigor, Karen set to work, making a series of carefully crafted phone calls and sending meticulously worded emails. She painted a picture of chaos and mismanagement within the task force, skillfully manipulating the information to cast doubt on their integrity. As the night wore on, Karen watched with satisfaction as the pieces of her plan began to fall into place. The philanthropist seemed increasingly concerned by the reports she was receiving, and Karen knew it was only a matter of time before the axe fell on the task force. "The Jeep will be mine," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "And there's nothing those so-called officers can do to stop me." Feeling confident in her impending victory, Karen retired for the evening, already dreaming of the day when she would finally teach the Jeep's owner a lesson they would never forget. The next morning, Karen woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She quickly dressed and headed to the office of the local philanthropist. determined to seal the deal and ensure the task force's downfall. As she strode through the opulent lobby of the philanthropist's headquarters, Karen couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. The plan was coming together perfectly, and she could practically taste the satisfaction of her impending victory. When she was finally ushered into the philanthropist's office, Karen put on her most sincere and concerned expression. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Mrs. Emerson," she began, her voice dripping with false concern. "I'm afraid I have some rather troubling news to share with you about the Oakwood Hills Police Task Force." Mrs. Emerson, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow. "Go on," she said, her tone indicating that she was not easily impressed. Karen launched into a carefully rehearsed spiel, detailing the alleged misuse of grant funds and the complete lack of oversight within the task force. She painted a picture of a rogue operation, one that was clearly taking advantage of Mrs. Emerson's generosity. "I'm simply appalled by what I've discovered," Karen concluded, her expression one of genuine concern. "As a fellow member of this community, I felt it was my duty to bring these issues to your attention." Mrs. Emerson's brow furrowed as she listened to Karen's account, her fingers steepling thoughtfully beneath her chin. After a long moment of silence, she spoke, her voice measured and deliberate. "Mrs. Jennings, I appreciate you bringing these concerns to my attention. However, I must say that I find your timing rather curious. The task force has been a model of efficiency and professionalism since its inception, and I have no reason to doubt their integrity." Karen's heart sank as Mrs. Emerson continued. "I will, of course, look into these allegations, but until I have concrete evidence of wrongdoing, I see no reason to pull the grant funding. The safety and security of our community is of the utmost importance to me." Mustering a polite smile, Karen thanked Mrs. Emerson for her time and excused herself, her mind racing with disappointment and frustration. The philanthropist's unwavering support for the task force had thrown a wrench in her carefully laid plans, and she knew she would have to regroup and devise a new strategy. As she walked back to her car, Karen's expression hardened with determination. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath. Not by a long shot. Undeterred by her initial setback, Karen spent the next few days meticulously planning her next move. She knew that the task force was her biggest obstacle, and she needed to find a way to neutralize their presence if she was going to get her hands on that Jeep. After careful consideration, Karen decided that the best course of action was to infiltrate the task force's headquarters and gather incriminating evidence that she could use to discredit them. It was a risky plan, but she was confident in her ability to execute it flawlessly. One evening, under the cover of darkness, Karen donned a black jumpsuit and a ski mask and made her way to the task force's nondescript office building. Using her extensive knowledge of the building's layout, she quickly located a side entrance and slipped inside, her heart pounding with adrenaline. As she navigated the dimly lit corridors, Karen's senses were heightened, and she moved with the grace of a cat, her footsteps barely making a sound. She knew that the task force was likely on high alert, and she couldn't afford to make a single misstep. Finally, she reached the door to the task force's main office, and after a brief moment of hesitation, she carefully turned the handle and slipped inside. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of a few computer monitors, and Karen's eyes quickly adjusted to the low light. Silently, she made her way to the desk in the corner, her gaze sweeping the room for any signs of movement or security cameras. Satisfied that she was alone, she quickly began rifling through the drawers, searching for any incriminating documents or evidence that she could use against the task force. As she sifted through the paperwork, her heart raced with excitement. This was it, the key to her victory. She couldn't wait to see the look on Mrs. Emerson's face when she presented her with proof of the task force's corruption. Just as she was about to slip a particularly damning file into her bag, a sudden noise from the hallway outside caused her to freeze. Holding her breath, she listened intently, her eyes darting around the room in search of a hiding place. But it was too late. The door burst open, and a group of uniformed officers stormed into the room, their weapons drawn. Karen's heart sank as she realized that her daring infiltration had been discovered, and she knew that this time there would be no escaping the consequences. As the officers surrounded her, Karen's mind raced with a desperate attempt to come up with an explanation for her presence in the task force's headquarters. But the incriminating documents in her hands told a different story, and she knew that her charade was about to come crashing down. "Ma'am, step away from the desk and put your hands where we can see them," one of the officers commanded, his voice stern and unyielding. Karen complied, slowly raising her hands above her head and taking a few steps back. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she could feel the sweat beading on her brow. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the overwhelming sense of dread was almost too much to bear. "Now remove the mask," the officer continued, his gun still trained on her. Reluctantly, Karen pulled the ski mask off, revealing her face to the officers. She knew that there was no way out of this predicament, and the realization that her carefully crafted plan had been foiled sent a wave of panic through her. "Karen Jennings," the officer said, his eyes narrowing as he recognized her. "I should have known you'd be behind this. What exactly do you think you're doing here?" Karen opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was completely at a loss for how to explain her presence in the task force's headquarters, especially with the incriminating documents still clutched in her hands. I was just," she stammered, her voice quivering with fear. "Save it," the officer interrupted, his expression hardening. "We've been watching you for weeks, Mrs. Jennings. We knew you were up to something, and now we've caught you red-handed." Karen's eyes widened in shock. They had been watching her. How could she have been so careless? She had thought she was being so clever. But the task force had been one step ahead of her the entire time. "You're under arrest for trespassing, theft, and attempted fraud," the officer continued, reaching for his handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the officer placed the cold, metal cuffs around her wrists, Karen felt a wave of defeat wash over her. All of her carefully laid plans had been for naught, and now she was facing the very real possibility of going to jail. She had underestimated the task force, and the consequences of her actions were about to catch up with her in a very real way. Karen sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, her hands cuffed in front of her as she stared blankly at the two officers seated across the table. The air was thick with tension, and she could feel the weight of her predicament pressing down on her. "All right, Mrs. Jennings, let's start from the beginning," the officer on the left said, his voice calm and measured. "What were you doing in our headquarters last night?" Karen swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her usual air of confidence nowhere to be found. The officer on the right leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Don't play dumb with us, Karen. We have you on camera, entering the building and ransacking our office. The evidence against you is overwhelming." Karen's heart sank. They had her dead to rights, and she knew it. Lying was no longer an option, and she needed to find a way to minimize the damage if she had any hope of avoiding serious consequences. "Okay, fine," she sighed, raising her cuffed hands in a gesture of defeat. "I was trying to find evidence that your task force was misusing grant funds. I wanted to discredit you and get the funding pulled so that you would be forced to disband." The officers exchanged a knowing glance, and the one on the left shook his head. "That's a pretty elaborate scheme, Karen, but why go to such lengths? What did you hope to gain from all of this?" Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze dropping to the table. I wanted to get my hands on a certain vehicle that's under your protection. The Jeep in the parking lot." The officer's expressions darkened, and the one on the right leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "So this was all about a Jeep. You were willing to commit multiple felonies just to get your hands on a car." Karen nodded sheepishly, her cheeks burning with shame. She had never felt more foolish and petty than she did in that moment, and the realization that her entire scheme had been centered around something as trivial as a vehicle was almost too much to bear. "Well, Mrs. Jennings, I hope it was worth it," the officer on the left said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Because you're looking at a very lengthy prison sentence for your little stunt." Karen opened her mouth to protest, But the officer held up a hand to silence her. "Same it. You can plead your case in front of a judge. Right now, you're going to sit tight while we process your arrest." As the officers stood and made their way to the door, Karen felt a wave of panic wash over her. She had never imagined that her quest to control the Oakwood Hills community would land her in such dire straits, and the thought of facing the consequences of her actions was almost too much to bear. The news of Karen's arrest spread like wildfire through the Oakwood Hills community, and the reaction from her fellow residents was a mixture of shock, outrage, and vindication. Many of the homeowners who had previously been the targets of Karen's relentless pursuit of power and control were now gleefully reveling in her downfall. They gathered in the community center, trading stories of her petty tyranny and sharing their hopes that she would finally face the consequences she so richly deserved. Meanwhile, Karen's allies within the HOA found themselves in a precarious position. They had long been complicit in Karen's abuse of power, turning a blind eye to her questionable tactics in exchange for her unwavering support of their own agendas. Now, with their leader facing potential jail time, they scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal and salvage their own reputations. The local media, sensing a juicy story, descended on the community like a swarm of vultures. Reporters interviewed residents, dug up past incidents of Karen's misconduct, and speculated endlessly about the potential fallout from her arrest. The case quickly became the talk of the town, with everyone weighing in on whether Karen had finally gotten her just desserts or if the task force had overstepped its bounds in their pursuit of the infamous HOA Karen. As the legal proceedings began, Karen found herself facing a daunting array of charges, including trespassing, burglary, and attempted fraud. Her once formidable legal team struggled to mount a convincing defense, hampered by the overwhelming evidence against her and the public's evident disdain for her actions. In the end, Karen was sentenced to a year in prison, a punishment that was seen by many as a slap on the wrist given the severity of her crimes. Still, the thought of spending time behind bars was enough to humble the once mighty HOA Karen, and she emerged from the experience a changed woman. Or so it seemed. As she was released from custody, Karen's eyes scanned the Oakwood Hills community, now devoid of her looming presence. She knew that her reign of terror had come to an end, and that the task force had triumphed over her petty schemes. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder if the Jeep was still under their protection, and whether she would ever get the chance to claim it as her own. As Karen walked out of the prison gates, she couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions, a strange combination of relief, humiliation, and a lingering sense of determination. Her year-long stint behind bars had given her a lot of time to reflect on her actions, and she couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret for the way she had treated her fellow Oakwood Hills residents. But even as she grappled with these newfound feelings of remorse, there was a part of her that still burned with the desire to reclaim her former power and control. The Jeep in the community parking lot had become a symbol of her failures, a constant reminder of the task force's triumph over her schemes. As she made her way back to her home, Karen's mind raced with ideas. She knew that she couldn't simply waltz back into the community and resume her reign of terror. The trust she had squandered would take time to rebuild. But she also couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the Jeep was still out there, taunting her. It was then that a thought struck her. What if she could find a way to make amends? To show the community that she had truly changed? Perhaps by reaching out to the owner of the Jeep, offering a sincere apology, and even offering to help with community projects, she could slowly regain the trust and respect she had once commanded. With a renewed sense of purpose, Karen set to work, meticulously crafting a plan of action. She would start small, volunteering at the local soup kitchen and attending neighborhood watch meetings, gradually building up goodwill and demonstrating her commitment to the community. And as for the Jeep, well, that would have to wait. Karen knew that her path to redemption would be a long and arduous one, but she was determined to see it through. She would bide her time, play the long game, and when the moment was right, she would make her move, this time with a more subtle and strategic approach. As she settled into her home, Karen couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would finally learn to balance her desire for control with a genuine concern for the well-being of her community. And who knows, Maybe she would even get the chance to claim the Jeep as her own, but this time through earned respect and cooperation, rather than underhanded schemes. Only time would tell what the future held for the infamous HOA Karen. But one thing was certain. She was no longer the same woman who had once terrorized the residents of Oakwood Hills. She was a changed person, determined to make amends and forge a new path forward.